March 1994. The air in Phoenix shimmered with the early heat of spring, and the streets hummed with life as they always did. But inside a modest home on the east side of the city, time seemed to slow, if only for a moment. Malik Coleman, a recently retired engineer, stood at the driveway, loading the final bag into the trunk of their rented Jeep Cherokee. His wife, Tasha, emerged from the doorway, one hand resting gently on the slight swell of her belly, the other adjusting her sunglasses. At 47, after years of heartbreak, hormone treatments, and quiet prayers whispered into the night, Tasha was finally pregnant. The glow on her face that morning wasn't just the Arizona sun, it was a dream finally within reach. This trip was their way of honoring that miracle, a celebration of beginnings, a journey across the Mojave Desert, through dusty valleys and open skies, toward a small, rustic inn on the edge of Joshua Tree. A place with no phones, no TV, just space to breathe. Malik had planned the route meticulously, the same way he had once drafted blueprints for bridges and buildings. He'd mapped the roads, checked the weather, printed backups of their itinerary. Tasha had laughed at his preparation, teasing that he packed like they were going to Mars. But she secretly loved how serious he took her joy. Their last known stop was a roadside diner just outside Barstow, where they ate pancakes and chatted with an elderly waitress named Donna, who would later recall how sweet and in love they looked. At 2:30 p.m., Malik called his younger brother Jerome back in Phoenix. "We're great," he said. "Tasha's glowing, I swear. The desert's beautiful. You got to bring Leona here sometime." Then static. The call dropped. Jerome tried calling back, but it went straight to voicemail. At first, he thought nothing of it. Desert service was spotty. But as the hours passed, then the days, unease crept in like a shadow slipping through a door left ajar. When Malik and Tasha failed to check in at the inn, and again failed to return home 3 days later, the family sounded the alarm. Local authorities launched a search across Mojave's vast, sun-scorched landscape. Helicopters scanned endless fields of beige and burnt gold. Search parties with dogs traced the dusty trails. Flyers were printed, shared, and soon faded on cafe windows. A week later, the Jeep was discovered. Parked neatly on a remote dirt road miles off any major path, the vehicle was intact. Keys still in the ignition, no sign of forced entry. Their bags, Tasha's sketchbook, even a half-eaten granola bar sat undisturbed inside. But outside, there was nothing. No footprints, no tire tracks, no broken brush or signs of struggle, just the wind, just the silence, like the earth itself had opened and swallowed them whole. The case confounded investigators. With no evidence of foul play and no leads to follow, it was quietly marked as an unresolved disappearance. A cold file buried beneath 100 others. But for Jerome Coleman, the silence was deafening. His brother wasn't the type to disappear. And Tasha, she had waited her whole life for that baby. He wouldn't believe they just walked off into the desert and vanished. Over the next 13 years, Jerome's life became a quiet war against uncertainty. He quit his job as a tax consultant and built an office in his garage filled with maps, police reports, and hand-pinned photographs. Every spring on the week of their disappearance, he returned to Mojave to walk the trails alone. He begged for help on forums, chased down psychics, and sent letters to journalists who never replied. He became a familiar face at ranger stations and sheriff's offices across Southern California, the man with the folder, the brother who wouldn't give up. And all the while, the Mojave Desert kept its secret. Dust to dust, wind to wind, nothing ever stirred in that valley of silence. Until one morning in October 2007, when a German tourist wandered off the beaten path in search of the perfect photograph, and instead found something the desert had hidden for over a decade. But that is a story for another part. For now, all we know is this. On a warm spring day in 1994, a black couple deeply in love, carrying hope and new life, drove into the desert and never came back. October 23, 2007. The Mojave Desert was still, its vastness broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through creosote bushes and the slow passing of clouds that did little to temper the relentless heat. A group of American tourists, led by a seasoned desert guide named Ramon Walker, had ventured off the usual trails near Amboy Crater. Their goal wasn't adrenaline or adventure, but photography, specifically the otherworldly silhouettes of century-old saguaro cacti, twisted into sculptures by time and weather. Among them was Darius Green, a 35-year-old landscape photographer from Oakland, with a growing reputation for capturing forgotten terrains. That morning, guided by instinct and light, he wandered nearly 500 meters away from the group into a shallow, dry valley rimmed with jagged rocks and sleeping sand. The sun was rising fast, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the desert floor. And then he saw it. At first, he thought it was part of the cactus, an odd protrusion tangled in thorns, but as he stepped closer, his breath caught in his throat. Entangled among the spines of a giant saguaro nearly 4 meters tall was the skeletal frame of a human being. Arms bent unnaturally, ribs sun-bleached and twisted by time, the figure had been lashed with steel cables directly into the cactus's trunk. The sight was grotesque. The desert had not buried this body, it had displayed it, preserved it like a monument to pain. Darius froze, camera dangling from his neck, and for a moment the only sound he heard was his own heartbeat. He stepped backward, nearly tripping over a mound of sand, and that's when he saw it. A piece of pink fabric, half buried, fluttering slightly in the breeze. With trembling fingers, he pulled at the cloth. It was a sleeveless blouse, dusty but shockingly intact, stained with something dark that had long since dried. Darius called out, his voice cracking the silence like a gunshot. Within minutes, Ramon and the rest of the group arrived. One woman screamed and turned away. Another dropped to her knees. Ramon, though experienced with the desert's strange finds, abandoned cabins, animal remains, old drug drop points, had never seen anything like this. Without hesitation, he radioed authorities. Within hours, the area was sealed off and transformed into an active crime scene. Detective Simone Carter from San Bernardino County, known for her unshakable calm and relentless pursuit of the truth, was assigned the case. Standing before the cactus, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. Forensic photographer Jacob Willis captured every angle, every thorn that had punctured bone. The steel cables, weathered but intact, were of a specific type, agricultural grade, plastic-coated, the kind used in vineyard trellises or heavy-duty fencing. Medical examiner Dr. Henry Wallace arrived before dusk. The removal process was surgical and delicate. Some bones had fused with the spines, the body's tissues long gone, but the agony of its final moments still etched in the pose it had died in. The blouse was carefully collected, its fabric torn in ways that suggested a struggle, perhaps even violence. Bloodstains, despite the years, were still viable enough to suggest trauma. As the evidence was logged, Detective Carter poured through missing persons records going back 15 years, dozens of cases, dead ends. Then, one stood out. A black couple from Phoenix missing since 1994. The woman, Tasha Coleman, had been pregnant at the time. She'd been wearing, according to her sister's original statement, a pink top with no sleeves, something she picked out just for the trip. The details struck like lightning. Carter made the call. Jerome Coleman, now 58, answered on the third ring. He had never changed his number. When Carter told him what they'd found, his voice cracked, but he didn't cry. Not yet. He boarded the next flight to California. Standing before the evidence table, Jerome recognized the blouse instantly. "She bought it after her second ultrasound," he said, holding it gently. "Said it made her feel powerful, beautiful." That moment ended 13 years of not knowing. Tasha Coleman had been found, but there was no sign of Malik, no other bones, no other trace. Detective Carter reopened the original case, this time with access to new tools, new databases, and a new urgency. What had happened to this couple? Who would do such a thing? Why here? Why now? Beneath the scorched silence of Mojave, The land had kept its secret for over a decade. But now, with bones in the cactus and blood on the sand, the desert had spoken. And someone, somewhere, was about to answer for what it had tried to bury. The reopening of the Coleman case sent ripples through old police files and long-buried testimonies, each one like a puzzle piece that had once been dismissed as irrelevant, now glowing with new weight under Detective Simone Carter's scrutiny. Among dozens of names mentioned in the original 1994 interviews, one began to rise again and again, not as a suspect, but as a ghost that had haunted Tasha Coleman's past. His name was Andre Phillips, a former boyfriend, once charming, later controlling, a man whose presence Tasha had tried to escape, but who never truly let her go. Between 1991 and 1993, Andre and Tasha had been inseparable, or so it seemed from the outside. But friends told a different story. Jealous outbursts, unexpected visits to her job, voicemails left in the dead of night. After Tasha ended the relationship, he spiraled. He lost his job at a car repair shop in Phoenix after punching a co-worker who made a joke about her. He had reportedly told one friend, "She'll never be happy with anyone else, I promise you that." The words now felt less like heartbreak and more like a prophecy. Detective Carter dug deeper. Andre had been briefly questioned in the original investigation, but his alibi, a weekend trip to Nevada with a cousin, had been accepted without much scrutiny. No charges were ever filed, but Carter's gut said otherwise. She pulled court records, medical histories, property deeds, and then there it was. Andre had purchased a small parcel of land in the Mojave Desert just 2 months after the Colemans went missing, a modest, off-the-grid property outside of Barstow, surrounded by nothing but dry brush and silence. The timing was suspicious, the location chillingly close to where Tasha's remains had been found. The deed was in his legal name at first, then sold under a trust in 2003 and abandoned. No digital footprint, no forwarding address. It was like he had vanished. But Carter wasn't finished. She traced the sale of the Barstow land and discovered a second property, this time under a different name, Ricardo Vaughn, a rancher operating in the rural hills of northern Mojave. Fingerprints on a document from the 2004 purchase matched Andre Phillips. He had changed his name, moved off the grid, and built a new identity from dust and lies. What chilled Carter most was how deliberate it all felt. She obtained aerial photos of the ranch and noticed fencing that used the same type of agricultural steel cable that had bound Tasha to the Cactus. That was all the confirmation she needed. Working with federal authorities, she assembled a tactical team. On December 15, 2007, under cover of dawn, they moved in. The ranch was isolated, the road leading to it so narrow and winding that backup had to wait at a checkpoint miles away. Andre, or Ricardo as the locals knew him, wasn't home, not at first. Then someone spotted movement near the back fence, a man sprinting toward the hills. It took 4 hours to track him. He was older now, grayer, but still strong. When officers finally tackled him, he didn't resist. He didn't speak, not a word, not when they read him his rights, not when they told him Tasha had been found, not even when they opened the folder with her picture. But the silence didn't last. Back at the station, something inside him cracked. Maybe it was the years alone. Maybe it was the pressure. Or maybe, for the first time, he wanted to be seen. Andre began to talk, first in pieces, then in torrents. The words came like floodwater from a broken dam, ugly, furious, obsessed. He had followed Tasha and Malik from Phoenix, hacked her work computer, memorized their itinerary, stalked them like prey. He faked a car breakdown on a side road they were scheduled to pass. Malik, ever the helper, pulled over. Andre ambushed him with a baseball bat. One blow, then silence. He kept Tasha alive for 7 days. 7 days. Each one more twisted than the last. He made her write letters begging for forgiveness. He recorded her crying. He told her this was what she deserved. On the 6th night, she broke free, ran barefoot into the desert. He chased her, caught her, and then he brought her to that cactus. I wanted her to hurt every second, he said. I wanted her to remember me forever. The confession chilled every detective in the room. It wasn't just murder. It was ritual, revenge as performance, pain as legacy. Carter listened, her jaw tight. She had seen cruelty before, but never obsession this vile, this methodical. In Andre's journal, later recovered from the ranch, were dozens of entries, maps, photos of Tasha from months before her trip, her grocery store, her classroom, even a picture of her holding the pregnancy test. He had been there, watching, waiting, planning, for years. The pieces fit together now, the mysterious disappearance, the silence of the desert, the cables, the blouse, the cactus. Everything pointed to one horrifying truth. Andre Phillips had turned the Mojave into his theater of vengeance, and for 13 years, no one had known the show ever took place. Until now. The trial began on March 10, 2008, in a federal courtroom in Los Angeles, where the air inside felt heavier than the desert heat outside. The gallery was filled with journalists, law students, grieving families, and strangers who had followed the story on national news, drawn in by its haunting details, the cactus, the steel cables, the vanished black couple whose fate had once been a whisper in the wind. At the center of it all sat Andre Phillips, now 66, flanked by court-appointed attorneys, his skin paler from years indoors, his eyes sunken but alert, scanning the room like a man still calculating exit routes. Across the aisle sat Jerome Coleman, shoulders rigid, jaw locked, his wife Leona beside him gripping his hand so tightly it turned white. 13 years he had waited for this moment. 13 years imagining what he would say, how he would react. But now, as he looked into the face of the man who had taken everything from him, he said nothing. The room would do the talking. The prosecution, led by U.S. Attorney Diana Rhodes, presented a case that unfolded like a tightly wound novel, one detail at a time, each thread connected with chilling precision. Rhodes introduced the confession first, but she didn't rely on words alone. She showed the jury photos recovered from Andre's hidden cache. Tasha, walking out of her school, Malik pumping gas, the ultrasound appointment circled in red pen on a calendar. Then came the journals, page after page of toxic obsession, laced with hatred, control, and ritualistic rage. But it wasn't until the blouse was presented in evidence, gently unfolded, blood-stained and fragile, like the wings of something broken, that the weight of the room shifted. Grown men looked away. A woman in the back row sobbed. The medical examiner took the stand and described in clinical but no less devastating detail how Tasha's body had been intertwined with the cactus, the way the steel cables had carved into her bones, the pattern of damage consistent with repeated attempts to move, each motion met by hundreds of thorns. She didn't just die, the examiner said. She suffered, slowly. The defense attempted what little they could. Andre's attorneys argued diminished capacity, that decades of alcoholism, isolation, and mental illness had corroded his sense of morality, that he had become unhinged, detached from reality. A forensic psychiatrist was brought in to describe him as a man consumed by delusions of betrayal and control. But when asked whether Andre knew right from wrong, the psychiatrist responded flatly, yes, he knew, he planned, he executed. That was all the jury needed. The most searing moment of the trial came not from experts or lawyers, but from Jerome himself, who took the stand on the final day of testimony. His voice cracked only once as he described the moment he was shown Tasha's blouse. I wasn't prepared, he said. Not for the smell, not for the way it folded in my hands. It was like touching her ghost. The courtroom fell completely silent. My brother Malik, he added, voice trembling now, was a man who would stop to help a stranger on the highway without hesitation. That's who he was, and that's why he died. The final blow came when Andre, under cross-examination, was asked whether he remembered Tasha's last words. He hesitated. His jaw twitched, and then quietly he muttered, "She said, 'You're not God.'" The courtroom held its breath. On July 15, 2008, after just 4 hours of deliberation, the jury found Andre Phillips guilty on all counts: double homicide, aggravated kidnapping, torture, and sexual assault. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the maximum penalty under federal law. As the verdict was read, Andre showed no emotion, no plea, no apology, just that same empty stare he'd carried into the desert all those years ago. But for the Colemans, it wasn't closure. It was a new beginning of grief. Outside the courthouse, Jerome told reporters, "Justice isn't a finish line, it's just a place where the pain changes shape." In the weeks that followed, he would wake from nightmares where Malik's face was blurred, where Tasha called out and no sound came. The images would never leave him, but neither would the strength of his pursuit. He had fought the desert, the silence, the disbelief of authorities, and he had dragged the truth back from where it was buried. The Mojave had swallowed his family, but it had not silenced them, not forever. And now, finally, the courtroom had echoed with their names. The courtroom doors had closed, but for Jerome Coleman, the echoes would never fade. In the months that followed the conviction of Andre Phillips, the pain did not lessen. It simply changed shape, like he had warned. Nights were restless, filled with images he had never seen but could not forget. His brother Malik, lying motionless under a desert moon. Tasha, brilliant, warm, resilient Tasha, trapped against thorns, her voice breaking into the wind. Grief didn't vanish with justice. It lingered in silence, in memory, in moments where the world moved forward but he could not. Leona, his wife, watched as he drifted further inward, consumed by a sadness even victory could not lift. It was her quiet insistence, one trembling morning over untouched coffee, that brought him to the office of Dr. Linda Chen, a trauma therapist who specialized in victims of unresolved loss. At first, Jerome sat stiffly in the leather chair, eyes refusing to meet hers, fingers locked like iron. "I should have saved them," he said, during his first session. Barely a whisper. "If I'd pushed harder back then, if I'd called more, if I'd—" But guilt, Dr. Chen reminded him, is a thief that lives in hindsight. What he had done, spending 14 years searching, refusing to surrender, breathing life into a case everyone else had buried, was not a failure. It was devotion. Bit by bit, week by week, Jerome began to reclaim pieces of himself. In the warmth of healing, he found clarity, and in clarity, purpose. In 2010, 2 years after the trial, he and Leona launched the Coleman Foundation for the Missing, a non-profit dedicated to helping families of color whose missing loved ones were too often ignored by law enforcement and media. They began with a small rented office in Phoenix, 1 printer, and 6 active cases. But their approach was different. Jerome spoke not as a distant expert, but as a brother who had walked barefoot across Mojave looking for answers. His story resonated. Donations grew. So did visibility. By 2015, the foundation had partnered with forensic genealogists, drone technology teams, and criminal analysts, helping to resolve dozens of cold cases from Alabama to Nevada. They didn't just bring closure, they brought voice. National conversations began to shift. News anchors stopped ignoring the faces of missing black women. Universities invited Jerome to speak on racial bias in missing persons investigations. In 2020, the Coleman Foundation was credited with assisting in its 200th resolution, some from decades past. Jerome stood at a press conference, older now, eyes framed by sorrow and fire alike, and said, "We couldn't save Tasha and Malik, but maybe we can stop the next family from waiting 13 years for someone to believe them." And he meant it. Meanwhile, Detective Simone Carter, now a senior advisor on federal cold cases, had become one of the nation's most respected voices in forensic persistence. She credited the Coleman case as her career's turning point, proof that the truth could rot in silence, but not forever. The place where Tasha's remains had been found, once just another dry scar on the earth, was now marked by a discreet bronze plaque, permitted by state and federal officials after a long appeal. It read, in memory of Tasha Coleman and all those whose voices were buried in silence. You are seen. Every spring, Jerome returned to that spot. Not with a search map, but with flowers, and sometimes, standing there alone, beneath the same sun that once scorched away every trace of hope, he whispered things to her, things he never got to say. Back home, the blouse remained preserved in a glass case, not as evidence, but as testimony, a reminder that what was torn and bloodied once belonged to someone vibrant, someone waiting to become a mother, someone who loved deeply. In schools across California, Tasha's story became part of a curriculum on domestic abuse, obsessive behavior, and how to recognize the signs before it's too late. Young women learned her name. Young men studied her case. And the cactus, that monstrous witness to her final moments, was left untouched in the desert, guarded not by fences, but by memory. A monument to what happens when justice takes too long, and when it finally arrives. Andre Phillips, now 80, remained in federal prison, reportedly silent, withdrawn, no visitors, no statements. Guards said he wandered the yard speaking to himself, sometimes calling out to Tasha in a voice that cracked through age and delusion. But no one answered, no one ever would, because the world had moved on, not in forgetting but in remembering better, in listening sooner, in honoring louder. The Mojave Desert still kept its secrets, but this one, it gave back. And what was once a whisper in sand became a voice that carried through generations, a scream no longer buried, a name no longer lost. Tasha Coleman, Malik Coleman, not just a tragedy, but a turning point, a legacy, a beginning,